Carl Hagberg is one of my all-time favorite people. He's a fellow publisher. He's got the Shareholder Service Optimizer, which is a tremendous publication. It's got his frank and practical insights. He's an inspector of elections. He runs his own team, and he's been in this business for over 50 years, so he certainly knows a thing or two. And he's got quite a way with words. I love listening to Carl speak and having one-on-one conversations with him as well. I'm Brock Romanek, today on Zippy Point. All right, so my big hero, Carl Hagberg, got him on Zoom. I'm so excited about that, Carl. This is the best part of the job, is getting to see my friends again, and so happy to have you on, especially since we're talking about an important topic that you know a little bit about, and that's the role of the inspectors of election and the tabulators. And the first question for you is, what's the difference between the two? What is an inspector of election? What is a tabulator?
In a nutshell, the tabulator, and there are a lot of people who could do the job as tabulators, so we'll discuss that, but they're there to count the votes, collect the votes, and the inspector of election is really to look over the shoulder and look into the workings of the tabulator to make sure that the votes are validly recorded. And then, of course, the inspector goes to the meeting and does the final tabulation if there are people there handing in proxies or ballots and so on. But they're two different roles. They should be thought of distinctly. In my opinion, the inspector of election should not be the tabulator. You want somebody who's checking on the tabulator, and checking your own work is always a bad idea.
So who typically is the inspector of election? I know that you and the people that work with you are typically in that role. Who are the other players in the industry?
Well, there are a bunch of freelancers. There are a bunch of former transfer agent employees who are freelancers. You know, we have a group of people with written procedures and kind of a pretty tight vetting system, but anybody can be an inspector, really. But to my way of thinking, when the first thing you do as inspector is to swear an oath, and to do this job to the best of your ability and with strict impartiality. And when you swear that oath, in my opinion, you become a fiduciary, both to the company and to the stockholders themselves. And so, you better know what you're doing. You know, just to say, well, I did this to the best of my ability. I didn't have much ability. I didn't know too much, but I fulfilled my oath. That isn't a good way to begin, in my opinion, for such an important role. And so it is a fiduciary role. So that to me is the number one thing you should be looking at. It's somebody who knows what they're doing, who will carry this out. And as I say, or as I should say, an employee, some companies will use an employee. The treasurer will be the inspector. While that's legal, it really isn't terribly smart, because one of the things fiduciaries are not supposed to have are conflicts of interest. Well, hello, if you're an employee, you automatically have a conflict of interest when you're counting votes, in my opinion. People will always be a little suspect. So it's not a wise thing, in my opinion, to appoint an employee or a retiree. You should never appoint a proxy solicitor, in my opinion, because they're being paid, sometimes being paid bounties to collect the votes and get a bunch of votes, you know? And so you don't want them checking their own work. Because there isn't a lot of, well, let's just say there are a lot of temptations to always favor your client and always favor your own judgment over what the rules may say. So that's it, kind of in a nutshell.
What's the typical timeline? Like, how far in advance of an annual shareholders meeting will you typically get hired by a company to serve as the inspector?
Most companies, well, guess what? Most companies, once they get an inspector of election that they like and that they trust and that shows up and does a job in a professional manner, they almost always want them back again the next year. The chairman likes to see a familiar face. Often we're the only person in the room other than his own employees that he recognizes. And so it gives a certain sense of confidence to have somebody in the room that everyone knows is capable. But if somebody is just, let's say, a new company, typically 30, 40 days would be about right. 40 days is probably good because with the way meetings crunch up against one another now, everybody's trying to pick the second and third Thursday in May and June, and now in July, and so sometimes the best inspectors may be taken. So 30, 40, 60 days is okay to appoint somebody, and then you don't swing into action until about 30 days before the meeting is to take place.
And then can you describe for us how that works then, your duties that actually lead up to the actual meeting itself?
Well, sure. The first thing you get appointed. The company should officially appoint you. Most bylaws specify how an inspector is to be appointed and who should be appointed, and so that comes first. Then we typically swear our oath well in advance and get it notarized, which is tough these days, and CV 19 days sometimes to get a notary. And so we get the oath signed and notarized, and we file it with the company. We do quite a bit of prep work. We're probably getting into our other discussion of what an inspector is really supposed to do, but many times we do need to look at the company bylaws, the articles of incorporation, and the bylaws, so we understand who's eligible to vote and what it takes to approve various kinds of proposals. And so we may have to do that. Increasingly, we have to look at voting agreements, and this is a relatively new, it's always been around, but it's been very, very popular of late to have voting agreements with large holders, sometimes to have voting caps, quite commonly to have anybody who has 5% or more would have a cap, a 5% cap on what they could vote. Some companies have voting agreements that require the signer to vote with the management position. They agree to do that as usually after a merger takes place and they become significant holders. So you have to you have to do some research to make sure you know who is entitled to vote, what classes of stock, sometimes preferred stocks, can vote on certain matters, and whether there's cumulative voting, which is a rare thing, as I know you've noted, but it's still out there, and you need to be aware of that. And that's pretty much it. And then, well, if you do find that you have people with voting restrictions or caps or cutbacks, you have to be sure that the company and the tabulator are finding out who these people are and where they keep their shares and how many of their shares are subject to this agreement. For example, I might be subject in my own account, but if I have a joint account with my wife, I may or may not be subject to the cap. So you have to figure out who is subject to the agreement, how many shares are still subject. I may have sold some or bought some since last year, and then where the heck I have them. And many times, particularly with large investors, they'll have their shares in several places. They'll use one custodian for one plan and another one for something else, and somebody else is in their trading account. So you have to hunt around, and that's where you need a good tabulator too, who knows where to find this information. And then, of course, come the end, since you are the inspector, you've got to be sure that the cutbacks were right, that the math was done correctly, before you sign off on the final numbers.
So then what's the duty of the inspector at the meeting itself?
Okay, well, this is where it's also important to have somebody who knows what they're doing. And at the meeting itself, if it still is going to be an in-person meeting, the inspector typically shows up in person and is there to receive any proxies and ballots that may be presented at the meeting itself. And some companies, hundreds and hundreds of proxies and ballots show up, other companies, none. But for larger companies, it's quite common for people to come, bring their proxy, hand it in, or to ask for a ballot and fill that out. And so you have to determine, A, are they entitled to vote, which is a fairly simple matter. If they have a proxy, you know they're entitled to vote because you know that they're holders of record. If they have a broker's card, they're probably not entitled. They're definitely not entitled to vote unless they bring a legal proxy, because the voting power resides with their bank or broker. So unless the bank or broker redelegates that power to the voter, they cannot sign a ballot and can't vote at the meeting. We never tell them that. We say, thank you very much for giving us this. And then we just quietly put that off to the side. So that is that. And then on occasion, people will challenge the vote and they'll say, who counted these? I've heard this more than once. Who counted these votes, Mr. Chairman? And how do we know that they're right? And so it's helpful to be able to point to an actual person who's not conflicted or not an affiliate of the company. And if need be, we have a little script, a little emergency script that describes in a few sentences what it is that we do to assure ourselves that this vote is correct. Okay? And we'll do more or less, by the way, depending if there are items that are close, and increasingly there are items that are very, very close and that sometimes go back and forth by 1 percentage point or so on the for and against during the course of the meeting. And so you often have to do a little bit more due diligence to make sure before you certify the vote. So that's that. And then, of course, then you'll issue your final report and you'll certify the vote. And the inspector's report is final. It's binding. And if anyone doesn't like it, they would have to go to a court and show cause that there was something wrong or an examination is warranted. And then in proxy fights, there's typically a formal challenge period where both sides will look over the other guy's votes to try to throw them out. And so, but that's for proxy fights. That's subject worthy of a special broadcast in itself. Proxy fights.
So what does an inspector's report actually look like? It's a one-pager?
Well, it would be nice if it would be one page, but if you've got 13 proposals, sometimes you're up to 5, 6, 7 pages. So it should recite the date and time and place of the meeting, the number of shares that were present in person and by proxy, that it constituted a quorum, and then it should show the voting. So if it's let's say it's majority voting, it would be for, against, and abstain. If it was plurality voting, it would be the old for and withhold thing. And then on each proposal, that you would show the for, against, and withheld or abstaining votes, and then the broker non-vote. Okay, and so for each proposal, you would detail what the outcomes were.
And then what about the tabulator? What's the role of the tabulator? Well, who typically is the tabulator? Let's start with that one.
Who typically uses a tabulator?
Yeah. No, who typically is the tabulator? Who gets?
Oh, okay.
Gets
Well,
that job?
okay. Well, so we'll go to tabulators. The biggest tabulator by far, of course, is Broadridge. And currently, Broadridge tabulates about 98% of all the votes at everybody's annual meeting, because they tabulate the entire street vote, or almost the entire street vote. They have a few competitors that may come in with 1 or 2 percentage points, but usually it's mainly Broadridge tabulating about 98% of the votes that are cast by institutional investors and big custodial banks, etc. And increasingly too, they have been taking voting away, and they've been taking the registered voting away from transfer agents. Every year they take more of it used to be that the transfer agents were the biggest tabulators. That's back when individual investors owned 70% of all the stocks, and there were millions of them. And so, but over time, that role has shrunk a bit, simply because sometimes your entire registered base has less than 5% of the total voting power, and it doesn't make sense to a lot of people to use 2 different tabulators. But if you have a lot of individual investors, you have a good relationship with your transfer agent, and often they have a good understanding of who these investors are and how they vote. As I say, some people still stick with their transfer agent for the registered vote, but more and more people are finding it just doesn't make sense to cover 2 or 3% of the votes to have 2 different tabulators. But all of the transfer agents can tabulate. The bigger ones are very, very good at it, and they know what they're doing. And so there's no issue there. It's more just a matter of convenience, I would say. And then,
what do they do?
Hmm?
What does a tabulator actually do?
Well, what does a tabulator do? Well, they tabulate, they add up the votes. And today, of course, it used to be that all these votes were cast on paper proxies and paper ballots. And now today, oh gosh, typically 90% of the votes will be cast electronically. It used to be a lot of people use the phone. Increasingly, people don't use the phone as much to vote, because if you've got 13 directors and you want to vote one by one, you could be half an hour on the phone. And so it's easier to tick the boxes. But a good tabulator must have the ability to receive votes by telephone, where there's a secure PIN to validate the identity of the voter. Then you need internet voting, and now internet voting, of course, is the majority. The majority of all votes cast are cast over the net, because all the big institutional investors, of course, are casting their ballots over some application, that goes right into the tabulating system. And then you still do need room paper for mail to come back, proxies and VIFs, voting instruction forms to come back to the tabulator. So that's what they do.
And would a tabulator actually show up at the meeting physically?
Almost never. No. They'd be sending their reports to the company and to the inspector, and then they'd be sending the reports to the proxy solicitor if the company is using one. And by the way, proxy solicitors are often tabulators, but they're usually keeping their own little tabulation using the Broadridge reports and the transfer agent reports, and then using their own idea of what votes they've rounded up to make sure they get into the count. So they're usually keeping a tabulation of their own. They should never be doing the master tabulation, in my opinion, because they have clear conflicts of interest there. But they're typically doing something, the back of the envelope calculation. Many times, by the way, they tell you, they'll tell the company, oh yes, we get another 1 million votes came in this morning, all in favor of management. Well, do not put them in your account unless you see where they came from and that there was room for those, so that there were control numbers that matched these purported votes, okay? Hope springs eternal in your proxy solicitor, but you have to be sure. See, and they don't have access to the master records, so they can't really tell if a big proxy comes in, whether it came in last week already, or that somebody's changing their vote. So they're not reliable tabulators as a rule. So that's kind of it.
You have a proxy fight, and so you do sometimes have shareholders that will revoke an earlier proxy just by submitting a later dated one. Who makes the judgment call as to which one is the later dated one? Is that the inspector or the tabulator?
That is the inspector's job, okay? If in a proxy fight, the inspector of election becomes much, much more important than ever, because, as I said, the loser will try to disqualify votes from the winner. And I've probably been at 12 or 14 meetings where the solicitor for the loser was able to invalidate enough votes or show that they were invalid to switch the election, okay? And so if there's a proxy fight, the inspector would give a preliminary report to give both sides an idea of how close the voting was, okay? And if it's close, and close is a matter of opinion too, and sometimes one big holder can flip the thing. So this happened to me. That's how I got in the proxy solicitation business one year at my bank, because a clever guy, he swapped the polls with duplicate votes, and then he got people to vote for the management slate, but with a plan to have them revoke at the end of the meeting and re-vote in favor of the dissident group, which he did. And he stood up and he said, these results are wrong. They flipped like in the last 1 minute of the meeting. And the company, was in, they were happy as clams. They thought they were winning by a 10% margin, and lo and behold, they lost by like a 5% margin because this guy cleverly lulled them into a sense of security, So anyway,
isn't that the plot from the movie The Hudsucker Proxy?
it could have been. It could have been.
I've never seen the movie. I don't know.
Someday we'll do one on weird things that happen at meetings, Brock. Okay, but so these things happen. So
what about reaching quorum? So you would know, I guess, leading up to the meeting, how close or how bad things are for the company in terms of reaching quorum. Is the inspector the one that's seen the vote come in, or I guess management has?
Well, the inspector, we're not. Yeah, our job isn't to urge votes to come in. We're not the proxy solicitor. We need to be neutral between them, and so we just sit there passively waiting for the final votes to come in. And then, as I say, and in many proxy fights, it really isn't clear until the morning of the meeting. Most people, they're like poker players. They hide their cards. They don't want you to know how many votes they really have. And institutional investors don't vote till the night before the meeting. And sometimes people will come. I've been at many meetings where people came with the proxies in their hand, okay? And they were going to hear both sides out before they decided how to vote. And it's actually funny. Sometimes a dissident group that was winning big, they'll get somebody up there who totally blows his presentation, and people come and revoke votes that they had cast for that guy. But so you never really know until the moment of the day of the meeting how things look, and then will be a challenge, and both sides will have a chance to look, and the inspector of election has to preside. We need to make sure that people aren't rifling through the paperwork and secretly pocketing stuff that doesn't go their way, So you have to be careful, and we need to keep everything in good order so that we can make sense of it, and then we can show people. It's usually a simple a matter. You end up with a stack of cards where there were multiple votes, and the winning card is on the top, okay? And you will be able to see, yes, this was the latest dated, or the one on the bottom may not have been signed at all, or may have some other defect that may have been signed by somebody who's not entitled to sign. In most states, for example, if you're the custodian for the minor, even though the minor is 35 years old, he can't sign that proxy until he's had the shares re-registered. It's the custodian who still has to sign. So there are many little ins and outs here that could cause a proxy to be disqualified, okay?
Wow. Crazy.
So that is an art and a science all of its own.
Not a job for the faint of heart.
Well, unfortunately, sometimes it is a job for the faint of heart. But you need to get an expert at both sides. There's no glory in winning only to be overturned later in a court of law. You know what I mean? You look like a fool. So you really do need to get it right when there's a close vote or an out-and-out proxy contest.
Great stuff. Thank you very much, Carl.